So welcome to the Mobile CSP webinar for November 12th, 2019. Tonight's webinar is about scoring sample performance tasks for AP Computer Science principals. Thank you to those of you who joined us and for participating in the polls. I will say now and reiterate from before that if you have not been an AP reader, we highly recommend that you sign up to be a reader. They all are continuously looking for new readers because of the high number of exams that need to be scored, and so it's a really great professional development experience as well. So some quick introductions. I am Pauline Lake. Many of you may know who I am. I'm the Curriculum and Professional Development Coordinator for the National Center for Computer Science Education, and I've worked with Mobile CSP since its inception. I'm also serving as the College Board Liaison, and we have with us two master teachers. I'm going to let them jump in to introduce themselves. So, Kevin?
Sure. Hello, I'm Kevin Saxton. I teach at Kent School in Connecticut, and I led with Sarah the professional development PD week in Colorado this past summer. And I've been a reader for both the principals and for CSA, and definitely second the fact that that's a great experience for what I can bring back to my students.
Thank you, Kevin. Sarah?
I am Sarah Walsh. This is my 4th year teaching the class and my 3rd year as a master teacher. I signed up to do the AP reading like the first year I did it. So the last couple of years I've done the create task, and my very first year I did the explore task. But it's been a little while since I scored it professionally, and I know that the rubric has gone through a couple modifications since then. But both of them have been extremely helpful in the way that I actually teach the class.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I think I'll just add, I didn't say it before, that I have served as a question leader for CSP. I have also served as a table leader for the last 2 years, and I have served all of those years scoring and reading the create task. So seen lots of them, and also been there since the original rubric and the changes that have happened as well. All right, so all of the information that we would go through tonight, there's one central place that you can go, and that is AP Central, for the name. The AP CSP exam page on AP Central specifically. So I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to show quickly how to get there and what it has available. And I'll put the link in the chat. Well, okay. So this page has all of the information about the AP Computer Science Principles exam, important updates here, as well as an overview of the assessment. There's also a link to the CSP course and exam description, which has the framework information about the exam and other important information as well. We'll be looking at some pages in that booklet tonight. There's also information about important deadlines, and as you scroll down, more information again about the exam itself, which we'll go through in a moment. And then, of course, there is the samples from the prior years of the exam administration, along with the scoring guidelines, a chief reader report, and there's commentary that goes with the scoring as well. And so there's a link here to go to past samples. You can see samples from 2018, 2017, 2016. Let me go ahead and go back. All right. So we are going to start off with the create task. The create performance task is the one where teachers are asked to allot 12 hours of in-class time for their students to develop a computer program of their choice. In Mobile CSP, students create a mobile app using MIT App Inventor. This project ends up being 24% of the overall AP exam score, and students complete their mobile app and then they answer questions or prompts regarding the development of the app, and they also are asked to include an algorithm or a complex algorithm and explain and show an abstraction as well. So the specific task instructions are in the CED booklet on page 120. Note that the page numbers here are based on the electronic version, so if you have the actual booklet, purple booklet, physically, the physical hard copy, the page number would be slightly different. But the first link here is to the student task instructions at the back of the CED. So it comes with an overview of what the student should be doing for that task, and it explains what they end up submitting. So they submit a video of their program running. It should be a continuous video that shows and demonstrates a working feature of their program, which again for Mobile CSP is an app. Their individual written responses about the program and development process, and then they submit their entire program code as well. So the task instructions give the program requirements as well as submission requirements for how to submit their project through the digital portfolio. And then as you scroll and go through, there are the actual prompts themselves. So the students are asked to answer 2A through 2D. And then they give their program code, which should have an oval around their complex algorithm and a rectangle around their abstraction. Okay. For the sake of time, I think that's what I'm going to give for now is the overview. I think those of you here tonight have seen the task before, you're familiar with the task, and you've taught the task. And so we really want to switch to focusing on looking at grading the sample. So the scoring guidelines that are available on AP Central, pages 2 through 4 are about the create performance task. So there are 8 rows that are scored, and there's the scoring criteria, the decision rules for whether or not to award a point, and then there are scoring notes to help with those decision rules as well. So in addition to these things and those materials, there are also teacher guidelines that are provided in the CED on page 87. Those guidelines go specifically into talking about what students are required to do for the program, as well as what teachers should do to help students prepare for the task, such as giving them and ensuring that students have 12 hours of class time to complete the task. And then the other important thing here is that what the teachers must do and what teachers may not do. So those are really important guidelines to review, and I highly suggest that you take time to read through those and make sure that you are doing what you should do, what you must do, and that you are not doing anything that is inappropriate when administering the task, which can be difficult because for some teachers to know what's okay and what's not okay, given that this is done in class and you give in-class time. So the students are working right in front of you, and they may come up and say, hey, can you help me? Right, and referring back to this document will let you know what you can and can't do to help those students. So what we'd like to do is to take some time to score the sample PT for Create, and that's really what this webinar is about, is to dive into the scoring. So in Unit 8 of Mobile CSP now, there are some sample tasks that were pulled out, and we'll go here. In lesson 8.9, you have to be logged in, but lesson 8.9 has create samples. So here, if you take a look, there's one sample and there's accordion style breakdowns by row. So you can go in, you can look at what the student submitted, what score they received, and the commentary that's associated with it. So this is Mobile CSP's way of showing in a friendly format all of the information, the same information that's provided on AP Central. Except on AP Central, the scoring commentary, as I showed earlier, is a separate document from the actual student performance tasks. And if you're looking at them on AP Central, you have to go back and forth to piece together, this is what the student submitted, and then go over to the scoring guidelines document and find what the score was and why it was scored that way. So we hope from Mobile CSP's perspective that this is a little bit more of a friendlier presentation to help both teachers and students understand and gain a better understanding of what's required for the task. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this link in the chat, and I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second just to double check. So we were originally going to do breakout rooms, but given that there are not many of us, I think it's okay for us to stay together in one larger group. Kevin and Sarah, I'm not sure who wants to maybe take the lead on this, but my vote would be, I think it would be really cool if we actually choose the 2019 sample to go through, since it's new. The other samples is one from 2017 that we picked and one from 2018. But I think the 2019, since it's so new, would be good for all of us to take a look at in case we haven't done that. So feel free to jump in whenever you want to share again. So to get to that third sample, again, this is lesson 8.9. There's a 2017 sample, 2018 sample, and the most recent one I put on there was the 2019 sample H, which used MIT App Inventor to create their program. If we're looking at row one requires that they have a video and that they show the running, continuous running of the working part of their program, and that they that they have shown at least one working feature. So we can go ahead and this is the video. Okay, so I am wondering, can you guys confirm, were you able to hear what was happening? What was being said?
There was no sound coming out of yours.
All right, so it might be because I have my headset on. I will say that there was no narration in the video, but you could hear background of students talking in the background. It wasn't bad, but you could still hear them. So taking a look at row one, we want to make sure the video demonstrates the running of at least one feature of the program. And then the response, audio narration or written response, identifies the purpose of the program and what the program is attempting to do. So the first part here, does it demonstrate at least one feature of the program? Do we think yes or no?
I think this is really hard because I saw things moving around, but could we say that demonstrated, without narration? I think it was really hard to tell what was going on.
I feel like as far as demonstrating, it's demonstrating that there's some kind of object interaction and that there's a counter counting down. So for the first part of the scoring rubric, it does demonstrate that. But because there was no audio narration and because we're not seeing
I just didn't show it. Yep.
Okay.
So there was no audio narration, but they can give a written response. So the programming language I used was MIT App Inventor. The purpose of my program is a game where the user clicks pictures of comments to get points with a time limit. My video shows how the game works, shows what happens when you win and when you lose. It shows how the timer counts down, how the score increases every time a comment is clicked. If the score reaches 10, then the user wins. If not, it does not reach 10, the user loses. So in terms of the first part, again, the video demonstrates the running of at least one feature of the program. There was lots of things submitted, right? I think, Joanna, you're exactly right. It demonstrated the timer that was happening. Did anybody see anything else?
I think, as she mentioned, the score was increasing as well.
Yeah. So it shows multiple things there. And then the second part of this is the response identifies the purpose of the program. And so it says here, the purpose of my program is a game where the user clicks the pictures of comments to get points with a time limit. So based on that, would you give a 0 or a 1?
I think I'd give it a 1.
Okay. So I agree, right? And we did see here, right? I showed it already. The score was a 1. The explanation is the video is continuously running and illustrates the running of the program. So just that, some commentary on that. Again, Kevin, Sarah, feel free to jump in. Is that sometimes we were seeing screenshots or the code. Students were showing the code itself and walking through the code and not actually showing the program running. So the continuous running of the program, and then to state the purpose. And it's a lot easier if they say the purpose is, and they fill in that sentence with the purpose. One thing, I know you couldn't hear it, but I did say there was some students talking in the background, is just be mindful of that when your students are creating their videos. If they're not planning to do narration, have them turn off the audio so that way it doesn't pick up, or have them try to record in a space that is a bit more quiet. Not sure, again, Kevin or Sarah, if what stories you have had with your reading experience, but I've heard some very interesting commentary and things being said in the background of some of the videos, and it's just sometimes unfortunate that it can be very vulgar things that are happening, and you are not supposed to let that as a reader impact the students' work, but just it's a lot better if you have the students be mindful of that when they're recording. What is the background like, and to have them listen back too as well and see what's happening in their videos.
I didn't have the background commentary as much. The thing that I interacted with more for this one was kids putting in their own background music. So like they would download a song and just play it in the background while they're clicking you around, and that was also unnecessary. If I don't have to listen to it to hear your narration, don't put anything back there. It doesn't make my job easier or harder. It just is unnecessary.
Right. So row 2, okay. As you see here, this part is the requirements, as you've seen, the score and the explanation. So 2B is what is used, the response in 2B is what is used for row 2, and we're looking to see, does the student describe or outline the steps used in the incremental and iterative development process to create the entire program? Let's see. Kevin, do you want to take this one?
Certainly. So really, as a reader, there's 3 parts that we're looking for. And the first part is the incremental, which is the story of how the app was developed from the beginning to the end. So this should be about the development, writing code, and not ideas. So of the writing the code, so I think successful responses usually included language like, first, I laid out the UI by adding buttons and images and labels, and then I added the code with the message, the handlers, the variables, and adding features like that. So it's sort of a zoomed out approach to the development. So this student says, to develop the app, I had to figure out a few small things to make sure it would run as intended. And then it goes into the difficulties. So the incremental needs to be independent from the 2 difficulties and opportunities. So this student goes right into difficulties and opportunities, which, without reading further, there's a pretty good clue that they're not going to get a point for the incremental here. So then they go into the difficulties. One difficulty I encountered was when I was coding the comments. I had to use a random integer procedure, and I did not know which numbers to use for the comments. I had to keep using different numbers to make sure they didn't go off the screen. So here, it's a bit of a challenge because clearly they're identifying a difficulty. Does anyone see a resolution for that? It's definitely muddled. So difficulties there, they're really putting it on the reader to decide if I had to keep using different numbers and looking at the app to make sure none of the comments went off the screen. That doesn't sound like a resolution. I went between the highest and lowest numbers for both the X and Y coordinates. Maybe that's getting to be a resolution, but it's very weak. Then they go into their second difficulty. I wanted to increase the speed of the comments. That sounds like a difficulty. It even maybe sounds like an opportunity. I tried decreasing the amount of time. However, there was a timer feature that counted down. And this was affected with the decreased intervals. Okay, so I have a difficulty. To fix this, I added a second clock and separated the timer from the comments. That looks like a very clear resolution. So I see 2 difficulties, 1 resolution, and certainly no incremental approach here.
All right, so let's see. We're going to go to row 3. Right, so again, row 2 was a 0, nothing about incremental or iterative development process. And we see the additional expression here or suggestion is have students keep a journal that describes their step-by-step development of the process of the app and the coding process. So row 3, surprisingly,
They actually gave it the point. I forgot. Yeah, I forgot that was separate. But yeah.
No, I think that was good because we were able to think about it. Hopefully,
Yep.
The others were able to think about it a bit before they actually saw the score there. Which maybe with this friendlier format is something that you don't really get a chance to do because the score is right here in front of you as you're reading. But yeah, so Kevin, do you want to read the explanation?
Well, sure, and I can read it, and I would give my advice is what I would tell my students to make sure that this gets the point. Mm-hmm. So it gets the point because, as we said, there are definitely two difficulties. The first difficulty being which numbers to use for the comments, and the resolution of the highest and lowest numbers for both the x and the y coordinates. They didn't really make clear when they were transitioning from what the difficulty was to the resolution. So I would certainly encourage students to use the phrase one difficulty and I resolved it by to identify the resolution. Because I think if they had that phrase in there, it would have been much easier for the reader to pull out the fact that the highest and lowest numbers was what they were doing to resolve it. The second difficulty was that the clock were both based on the same timer, the comments and the clock were on the same timer, and the resolution was the second clock, which was well done by saying this was resolved by adding a second clock. So the second one's done very well.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. 4 is whether or not their oval code has an algorithm. So hopefully you didn't see it yet. I'm going to go over here to row 4. Does the selected code implement an algorithm? Do not award a point if the algorithm consists of a single instruction or if the code segment is not included in the written responses section or is not explicitly identified. The student has to explicitly identify that as their algorithm. And then in the notes, it tells you algorithms are precise sequences of instructions for processes that can be executed by a computer and are implemented using programming languages, and they make use of sequencing, selection, or iteration. So the student identifies this block of code, which is the when clock 1 timer event handler, as their algorithm. Do we agree? Is this an algorithm or no? Okay, I'm going to go with yes, right? Because it's not a single instruction. There are multiple things happening here. The variable is being decreased. It's displayed in a timer label. And then there's also an if statement that helps determine whether or not to open the next screen. So the score that it was given was a 1. By definition of an algorithm, the selected code segment does implement an algorithm. The main algorithm block is the clock 1.timer block. Now the other piece of this is that they have to explicitly identify it, and in this case, although I didn't show it here, the written response matches the selected code. So as we'll see in the next part here, the student talks about this particular algorithm. So row 5. Row 5, there's a bunch of things we need to look for. Again, Kevin and Sarah, feel free to jump in. I think this is one of the hardest rows of the rubric. This one and row 6 definitely take some time. So first, you need to make sure that this is the selected code segment implements an algorithm that uses math or logical concepts, and the response has to explain how the algorithm functions, and it has to describe what the selected algorithm does in relation to the overall purpose of the program. So going back, did it have math or logic? Yes, right? So it has both the decrementing of a variable and it also has an if statement. Okay. So the next 2 parts require reading the response. So here's the student response here. Whenever the clock ticks, the time variable decreases by 1. The timer label is changed to timer in the current value of the variable. This makes it so that the screen shows the timer label decreasing by 1 every second. If the time variable gets to 0, then another screen is open, and the score variable, which changes from other events in the app, is sent to the new screen. Because of all of this, the time variable counts down every second, which is visible to the user of the app. And once it hits 0, another screen is open to show the user the result of the game. So it had math and logic, even though it only needed one of them. Does it explain how the selected algorithm functions? Yes, right? And the specific place it does that, it says where it talks about the time variable decreasing and the timer label changing. And then lastly, we have to make sure that it describes, the response describes what the selected algorithm does in relation to the overall program. Okay, so it does that by saying the time variable counts down every second, which is visible to the user of the app. Once it's 0, and the screen is open to show the user the result of the game. In order to score the point for this, students have to hit all 3 parts of that requirement. I would say from my experience, in terms of what it does in relation of the overall program, I would have been looking maybe for a little bit more here. It talks about shows the user the result of the game, but maybe with my students, I would give them direction to be specific, right? So they're talking about the game. What is the game? Go back to almost reiterating what they had in the first prompt into A, where they talk about what their program actually does, right? So in this case, coming back to the fact and mentioning, the comments, and what was happening with those comments. Does that make sense? All right. Sarah, you want to try row 6?
Sure. So row 6 for me is probably one of the easiest to score, because if you look at the code, it's really easy to tell if it applies or not, because it's a binary coding system. Either they get it or they don't. So if they don't hit any of those, then they don't get the point. So for me, when I explain this to how my students, I explain it as having one parent algorithm that calls on 2 child algorithms, and then they should be set for this. If you look at the code from row 4, that if statement, it could almost be one child algorithm, but they don't have anything else in there. There's no other decision making. There's no procedures called. The easiest way for kids using App Inventor is to write 2 different procedures and call them in one block of code. But this does not do that by any stretch of the imagination. It has one if statement that does use math. It uses logic, but it definitely doesn't have 2. So that's kind of the key for me, that they would not have gotten the point. It did not hit A. So the selected code algorithm implements an algorithm that includes at least 2 or more algorithms. It did not have that. It had B. One of the algorithms uses logic. And they did talk about how the clock works independently, but because they don't have those 2, that row 6 gets 0 points.
And I just want to point out in the explanation here that even if we did see 2 sub-algorithms here, it is up to the student to identify those. We as readers cannot assume, we have to be able to see it, and the student has to clearly identify it, both of them in the sub-algorithms in their response. Right, so that is the extra comment that is here. Okay. Row 7 is about identifying an abstraction, which the easiest way in App Inventor to do that would be a procedure. And it has to be, in this case, a student-developed abstraction. That's really important. So that's why students using a procedure, usually is what would be the best way to get the point for MIT App Inventor, because students are creating those procedures. In this case, there is no abstraction in this code here. Some may say, well, there's a variable. Well, variables in App Inventor are not student created. They come with the program. Students simply name them, right? They're not student defined and created. So therefore, this would be a 0. And row 8 is about explaining how the selected abstraction manages the complexity of the program. So in this case, the response does not address managing the program's complexity. And I will note here that, and it's in the scoring notes too, even though the student didn't get a point for row 7 because they used a variable which is not student created, they can still get the point for row 8 if they talk about how the variable manages complexity. Another common one, Kevin and Sarah, feel free to jump in, we saw was event handlers for button clicks being abstraction, I believe is one that we kept seeing, in particular for students who had used Code.org's App Lab. They were submitting those as button click event handlers as their abstraction. Those are not student created. So they would not get the point for row 7, but they could still get the point for row 8 if they explained how it manages complexity. All right, I am going to stop sharing for a second and just check in. So we made it through one full sample. I just want to check in, see, are there any questions about the create performance task scoring? If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, my next question is going to be to Kevin and Sarah, or anyone else who may have been a reader. Do you have any comments, thoughts, suggestions that you'd like to add to this from the perspective of a reader?
Less is more. That many times students use a sort of shotgun approach to these answers, and they write and write and write and write, but they don't actually get to the point. Each prompt has a word limit, and while the College Board has never enforced that, that word limit is plenty to actually answer the question. So it can really help a student focus in on what is the answer they need to give. So instead of writing 14 paragraphs about the fact that they had this idea and they were thinking about in the shower, and then they changed their idea, and then their friend said that was a bad idea, and they go through this whole story, but that isn't pertinent to what they're trying to answer. So really ask the students to be concise with their language, and it takes practice. So that's why the practice create is important. That's why the reflection questions that are relevant to this are important to practice and give students feedback on that. I put prompts on my quizzes, so every week they'll have a time where they have to write an answer on a quiz under a little bit of pressure and being concise.
My overall advice is that the write-up is not a sales pitch for the app that you've developed. A lot in the reading, kids are very proud of what they've done, but that makes it have a hard time when they're trying to analyze the way that they actually coded. So when they're coming up with difficulties, they see that as a weakness and not as a chance for them to become a better programmer. So a little humility I guess in computer science goes a long way for helping them write it up. And kind of like Kevin said, we don't want the story. This is a technical writing piece. We don't need to know, the analysis of, your best friend's routine and things like, and that's how you decide to develop your app. We just want to know the actual process of developing the app.
Right, so we do have a question. Is the purpose okay? What is accepted as a purpose? Is the purpose okay if it is as simple as the purpose of this app is to entertain someone with this fishing game? The answer is yes. And I want to go back to sharing my screen here. So we have the create scoring guidelines here. And if you take a look, in the scoring notes, purpose means the intended goal or objective of the program. That's what the student wants it to be. That's what the student says it is, right? So it's absolutely enough to say the purpose is, to be a game. Kevin and Sarah, again, you may have seen a lot of these. I know I did. I saw a lot saying the purpose of this is, a game so the user can have fun.
I can't remember an instance where someone said the purpose of my app is, and they said anything that disqualified them from the point. Once they have that phrase and then they say something coherent in English, they're going to get the point for that, or at least the sub point for that criteria.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I would note here is it even says in on the scoring guidelines too that even if the student just describes and explains the function of the program instead of the purpose, so they say this is how it works, right? That is okay as well. So really, if I had to summarize this, it's really telling the reader what does the program do? What is it supposed to be for? And that is really up to the student and what their intention was, and we can't say, it should have been this or that, because it's the student's program. Okay.
And it's kind of like what Kevin said earlier with keeping it short and sweet. They don't even need the whole rest of that. They can say the purpose of this app is a game.
Mm-hmm.
Get the point.
Yep. Absolutely. Any other questions about create? If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also email us directly through the Teaching Mobile CSP forum. I'm always available to help there. Other teachers are, the master teachers are, Kevin, for example, Kevin and Sarah are on that forum as well and can help answer questions. So feel free to reach out. But again, the best advice that I feel I can give is to tell you to actually be an AP reader and to get that experience if you can, so you can go through this specific training and really grading enough of these back to back and being able to, as the chief reader says, become one with the rubric, really allows you to get a deeper understanding of what's being asked, and then you can take that back to your classroom and help your students understand what they need to do to meet the requirements for the task. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. I do realize we're after the hour here, but we did start a little bit late. So I'm going to try to get through one explore task in the time that we have. The Explore performance task is a task that teachers must allot 8 hours of in-class time for students to complete, in sort of a research project, if you will, where students identify a computing innovation of their choice, and they research and explore the impact that it's had on society, and they also create a digital artifact to represent some effect that the innovation has had. The task overall counts as 16% of the overall AP CSP exam score. The student task directions are found in the CED, page 115 of the electronic document, so I'll just bring that up briefly. So here, so students are, again, they're asked to submit a computational artifact that they create and their written responses about their computing innovation that they selected. The task instructions go through the general requirements of what students are asked to do, okay, as well as the submission requirements and what they should be submitting on the digital portfolio. And then there are the prompts 2A through 2E that the students must respond to in their written responses. Okay. And then there's additional information, of course, for preparing for the Explore task. Also provided to you are the scoring guidelines on page 5 through 7, so the scoring guidelines. Again, those are listed on AP Central. The first part of the scoring guidelines, pages 2 through 4, are the Create performance task guidelines. But once you get down to page 5, you then see the Explore performance task guidelines. The scoring guidelines for the Explore, there are 8 rows. Each row can be given a 0 or a 1. There's the scoring criteria column, the decision rules column, and the scoring notes column to help with explaining and understanding what the decision rules are and when to award or not award a point. There are also, just with the Create teacher guidelines on page 82 of the electronic CED document. Those guidelines explain what the teacher should do, must do, and what they may not do. So those are important to review. It explains examples of what an effective artifact versus ineffective artifacts might be. It's important to go over this when you're doing the practice Explore with your students so they understand what they should and should not be doing for the official task. Again, I just want to point out here, I'm going to scroll down to what teachers may not do during the administration of this task. It's very important to make sure you have reviewed those as a teacher and that you abide by those when administering this task. So we want to make sure we get through a sample here. Again, just as with the Create, there are samples in Unit 8. So Lesson 8.10, notes here, has the couple samples in this friendlier format that Mobile CSP has done. Again, on AP Central, you can access all of the sample tasks that are there, plus their scoring, commentary, and the chief rater report. But Mobile CSP has gone ahead and made this format here with these drop-down accordion styles row by row, so you can see what the student has submitted, plus the score, plus the explanation for those. I have not yet put in a 2019 sample here, but the 2019 samples are available on AP Central. And for the purpose of the webinar now, we can go through one of the 2018 samples. Not sure. Sarah, do you have a preference? Pick on you.
Let's do the sample B.
B. All right. So let me make sure I got the guidelines are up here for us. Close these other tabs. So looking at row 1, we're going to be looking at the computational artifact. We want to make sure that it identifies a computing innovation and that it provides an illustration, representation, or explanation of the innovation's intended purpose, function, or effect. So if we go ahead and look at row 1, this is the student response. Maybe I need to zoom out a bit so you can see all of it. Does it identify the computing innovation? Hopefully everybody is thinking yes, right? Virtual reality is a computing innovation. And the second requirement is that the artifact must provide an illustration, representation, or explanation of the intended purpose, function, or effect. In this case, it displays or shows the purpose, which in this case is to enhance or replace the world around you with a virtual one that can be modified. So the score received for this is a 1. They receive the point for that row. Kevin, is there any comments about or suggestions for the artifact based on what you've seen with your students?
No, I think sometimes students get a little wrapped up around it. It can be pretty simple. They really get to the core of identify the computing innovation and provide some illustration of the purpose, function, or effect. Just get to those two things and don't get too wrapped up in making it spectacular.
Mm-hmm. Any suggestions on what tools your students have used?
They use all sorts of things, but I think the most successful end up using a PowerPoint or a Google slide or a Google Doc, something simple. They spend more of their time on the research and the writing rather than getting too crazy with this artifact.
Okay. All right. Row 2, I want to go over here before we look at the scoring guidelines. Row 2 is scored by looking at response 2A. Does it state a fact about the correctly identified computing innovation's intended purpose or function? So does it state row 2? Student says the computing innovation that I chose is virtual reality. This innovation has many different functions depending on the design. Its intended purpose is to enhance or replace the world around you with a virtual one that can be modified. It can be used for things such as shopping online, gaming, and training. The computational artifact depicts an environment that is being filmed in virtual reality. It shows one of the many purposes of innovation, allowing others to experience that environment without taking time to travel there. Also, the lower pictures illustrate how the innovation works and looks. So do they state a fact about the correctly identified computing innovation's intended purpose or function? Yes, and you can highlight that, pinpoint that being it can be used for things such as online shopping, gaming, and training. So the score awarded for this was a 1. Okay. Let's see, Sarah, you want to do row 3?
Sure. So for row 3, the main thing that you're kind of looking for is that phrasing and effect the innovation has. And you want to keep in the back of your mind the intended use of the innovation. So one thing that, kids try to do is they try to, say hackers are going to get this, hackers are going to do that. But Hackers, cost, barriers, things like that are not necessarily something that you need to focus on in this write-up. It needs from direct use of the innovation. So for this one, if you look, the virtual reality has the potential to change many things about the way we interact with computers in our environment. That's kind of vague. Virtual reality exists in two forms. Virtual reality creates new virtual world around you, while augmented reality enhances your surroundings to provide information. So that still is just kind of explaining how virtual reality works, what it's providing. So some of this probably could have been consolidated a little bit. You can tell this is someone that put a lot of work into the writing, which is great. But at the same time, they're not quite getting to the point yet. Augmented reality has significant potential to change the way we interact in the future by providing us with beneficial information such as time, messages, direction, and other relevant or timely information with ease. So now we're kind of getting into a little bit more nitty-gritty of it. But if you look down below, it says by wearing a pair of glasses, one could read messages without holding his or her phone, reducing distractions. Since it's easier to focus on your surroundings when not looking at a phone, augmented reality has the potential to cut down on distracted walking or cycling related incidents. So that little blurb right there gets the point for the write-up for row 3.
And I would just add, again, students in the College Board has acknowledged this, that students have had trouble understanding what an effect is. So in the additional explanation, it reiterates this scoring notes comment that an effect may be an impact, result, outcome, etc. I think one really great thing to try to do with your students is to give them examples where they tell you, is that an effect or not, or is it a possible effect or not of a computing innovation, and let them practice, get practice with identifying what an effect really is. Yeah. Okay. Row 4. Kevin, you want to try?
So row 4 now gets a little bit deeper, and it's actually asking for a beneficial effect and a harmful effect. So now to get row 4, you need to have one of each, and you need to be explicit about it. So students, you need to use language like a beneficial effect. So, you can read through this, but then you finally get to the sentence that says, a beneficial effect is, since it is easier to focus on your surroundings when not looking at a phone, augmented reality has the potential to cut down on distracted walking. So it says it's beneficial, and it is an effect because we have that outcome of cutting down on accidents. Likewise, it says a harmful effect. People may become absorbed in the virtual world and only interact through it instead of through face-to-face communication. So there is an outcome using virtual reality may have this impact.
Yep. And again, this is another case where being explicit, using sort of, I don't want to say the sentence starters, but using the terminology to say the beneficial effect, the harmful effect, is super important. Like they really need to do that here. Okay. Moving on, row 5. So row 5, again, it's still looking at this same response. So notice for the last few rows, this one paragraph here that the student wrote is addressing, or should address, rows 3, 4, and 5. In row 5 here, we're looking to see, does the response explain how one of the identified effects relates to society, economy, or culture? So they need to pick one of those explicitly. In this case, when they talk about the harmful effect, So the harmful effect a virtuality may have on society. They specifically are talking about the harmful effect as it relates to society. So therefore, they received a score of 1 here. I think this one is pretty straightforward again, but they need to identify explicitly society, economy, or culture. Right? So the explicitly identifying what it is they're referring to is really important with this particular response to C. Okay, row 6. Sarah, you want to go again?
Sure. So for row 6, one of the key things I try to help my students understand is that data is not data, hardware is not data. You have to be very explicit on what data is gathered. So virtual reality uses image, motion, orientation, and distance data to operate. There you go. So that, for me, an image is data, distance is data. We're already on the right track. Part B is explain how that data is consumed, produced, or transformed. So they've already specified that images, motion, orientation, distance are the data that's used. And then they do actually say that the data is consumed by the headset to allow the headset to detect other user input in its surroundings. And then it's transformed by the program running on the headset to show the user output to the user in the form of an image and audio data. So they actually do specify that it's transformed from data input into the headset, the image and motion, and then it's output in the form of image and audio data. It's a little vague, but it is there. So they would get that point. I usually try to encourage my students to be very explicit on what the output is. And the nice thing about it is a lot of things count. I think even in the rubric, it specifies it's as long as it's like numbers, Booleans, video, audio, text, picture, position, distance, things like that. It's all, they basically, as long as it's a output type thing, then they get the point for that. But they do have to hit those 2 keys. They have to specify what the data is and what happens to it.
Perfect. Let's see, 7. Kevin, you want to go one more time?
Yeah, I think 7 tends to be a challenging one for students because you really have to keep the frame of mind of using the innovation as it's intended. And so often this is where students want to go to hacking because a storage concern is it could be hacked, but hacking is not the intended purpose of most computing innovations. So they really need to think about when you're using the innovation as it's intended, what is a data storage, privacy, or data concern? So this one does a nice job. This one says the potential ability for companies to access the video or other sensor data recorded by these headsets, which could be used for things without your consent. So these devices are collecting this data when this data is being generated when you're using the headset as intended, and now that data really it's privacy because then they could track you or find your location or things like that. So they do a nice job of identifying that.
And so my comment would be about the last couple of rows here, working with your students to identify what is an effect, what are the different types of effects, whether it could be beneficial or harmful, what is data, what does it mean for data to be consumed, what does it mean for it to be produced, what does it mean for it to be transformed, and then here, what is data storage, what is data privacy versus data security. And so in my view, my perception of this perspective, I guess, is that it is really a lot of terminology leading up to the Explore task that you have to make sure your students are familiar with and they understand differences. And that can be done through doing a complete Explore practice task, as we suggest in Mobile CSP, but also by taking bits and pieces and spreading them out and having students look at things like current events and how they impact computer science and the impact they're having, and looking at bits and pieces, or one piece of this at a time and building upon it, making sure again that students understand the definitions and what these mean and what are examples of them will really help. And then in the end, they don't have to address all of them, right? Notice that for these the last two rows, that these are ors, right? How the data is consumed, produced, or transformed. And here it's data storage, data privacy, or data security concern. So while the students should learn what all of these mean and be able to identify them, they only need to do one for the data being consumed, produced, transformed, and one for data storage, privacy, and security. To wrap up, the last one here is about row 8, references. Students should have references through in-text citations and at least 3 different sources. So they want to be looking for recent sources when they're using their, when they're doing their research project and doing the research. The in-text citations, there is no specific format or style that the College Board says students have to use, but it is a good idea to have your students pick one and stick with that. But there does have to be somewhere in there at least 3 in-text citations. Those can be done by using a regular APA MLA style format. You can use parentheses, footnotes, or any number system to be able to identify those. And so in this case, the student had their sources at the end cited, but as you saw, if we go back to their writing here, they also had in parentheses, they identify the source right in line in text in their response. Okay.
The only trick to that one that I've found is if kids choose to number, make sure that they also number their quotes in the section 8. So if they use resource 1, resource 2 in the write-up, that's fine, but then they need to be numbered 1, 2, 3 in the write-up at the end. Because if you can't assume that the first one is number 1. So they would lose that point if they didn't do that.
Thank you, Sarah. So in this case, I'm going to open it up real quick to Kevin or Sarah or anyone else who's been a reader, and just open it up. Is there anything from a reader's perspective that you would add to this? I know we didn't do the breakout rooms, we didn't have enough, but is there any advice you would give to those watching now or later about the Explore task?
I would just reiterate, practice, 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 and part of that practice, have them actually write, because they can get things in their head and make sense of it, but then they struggle when they try to put it to words. So practice both the identifying of effects and such, but also writing about them.
I usually tell mine to write the write-up like they're addressing a pretty with it 10-year-old. They are very competent, but at the same time need it a little bit spelled out for them. So say the camera captures images and there's your data. It's, they really do just have to spit it out.
My advice again, make sure you get the opportunity at least 1 year to be an AP CSP reader. I have not officially done it for the Explorer, but I've unofficially been a part of the trainings at the reading, and also with the College Board as well. But again, for both the Create and the Explorer, I really highly recommend that you sign up to be an AP reader if you haven't done that, and get that experience for yourself as an instructor, and to also be able to bring back information to inform your instruction with your students when you're preparing them for these tasks. Um, with that, I'd like to say thank you to those who joined us, and thank you to Kevin and Sarah for their perspectives. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out via the Teaching Mobile CSP forum. If there are specific samples you'd like to take a look at, be sure to let us know. Again, the 2019 samples are now available on AP Central. With that, I'll say thank you and go ahead and stop the recording.